Welcome back to the Perpetual Wealth Podcast, a show for clients of Paradigm Life. This season, we're empowering you to take control of your financial future using the core principles of the Perpetual Wealth Strategy. Now, before we dive in, a quick but essential disclaimer. While this podcast is primarily for our valued clients at Paradigm Life, it's open to anyone interested in enhancing their financial knowledge. However, please remember that our information should not be taken as a direct tax, legal, or financial advice. We strongly recommend consulting with a wealth strategist at Paradigm Life or your financial team before making any decisions based on our discussions. Today, we continue our journey into cash flow, protection, and wealth building, the foundational principles of the Perpetual Wealth Strategy. Let's dive in and explore how to optimize your wealth and achieve financial independence. Your journey continues now. Hey everybody, this is Patrick Donohoe. I'm joined by my good pal, colleague, dear friend, Gary Pinkerton, and we are doing episode 2 of a 3-part series on real estate. This episode is called Home Sweet Home, the ins and outs of where you lay your head. All right, so Gary, what do you think about our previous episode? Let's recap that quickly, maybe for those who are just listening or watching this episode. I think it was important to me. I love talking about the philosophy behind just property and real estate and how human beings can use it and essentially, express their creativity and their insights and their intuitions and whatever to improve it and have multiple uses of it. But what do you take from it? Like, what are the biggest things you have realized around just the nature of property, the principles of real estate?
Yeah. So, my biggest aha moment from that podcast and also our prep for it, our conversations, was that everything happens on property or at a property. So that was a huge takeaway, and we talked a few minutes about that. As far as my passion on the topic, I call myself the real estate guy here at Paradigm Life, and I love to talk with clients and attract clients who are equally interested in it. Fundamentally, and the reason I'm so passionate about it is not because of the tenants and toilets phone calls you get. It's not even about the cash flow. And it's not really about the growing of wealth long-term and protecting yourself from inflation. All these things we're going to get into. It is really about continuing propagating the experiment that was created under the philosophy of John Locke that we talked about, and really that to have freedom, you have to have property and the ability to control it and grow it and improve your own life through acquiring and growing and best use of real estate.
Yep. So this topic I think is interesting because I feel where a person resides is really important. And there's so many varying opinions of should you rent, should you own, do I do a 15-year mortgage? Do I do a 30-year mortgage? Do I do a big down payment? Do I do a low down payment? How do I determine how much money or how much home I can afford? I mean, there's so much that goes into it, and it can get confusing, right? And I can see why people, tend to gravitate this way or that way, which, tends to be just, I would say the extension or drafting behind the philosophy of somebody else without really getting into, okay, well, why do they have that opinion, right? Is there another way? Maybe that other way is better for me. So I'm excited to get into this conversation because it's a decision everybody is going to be making, right? If you haven't already, you've already made it, and you're going to be probably making it in the future again.
Yeah, so, and it says so much about the individual, right? About their personality, about how they think, right? Just the house. Like, you can't tell everything about a person, but once you know who lives there and then you see the house, you'll know a lot about that person. For example, Warren Buffett's house, like a pretty conservative house, but when you know what he's worth, you know a lot about the guy and how he thinks.
That's interesting.
Right? Yeah. And so a lot of people, because of that, they wrap up their identity in their house, right? And it's a big part about them. And sometimes it's about their ego and what's on social media and everything. For me, I'm kind of the other side. I'm a little bit more on the Warren Buffett side. It's all kind of about the numbers. And so for me, I don't attach that much to where I lay down my head. If I don't lay down my head here tomorrow because that all fell apart, I'll lay down my head over here somewhere, right? And so, but most people that is I would say, the small part of humans. I would say that a majority, the minority is what I was trying to come up with. The majority really, really tied their identity to it. So again, it's a really important decision.
Yep. So this brings up a cool story that I heard and kind of made the connection as we were preparing for the podcast. So I'm a Utah Jazz fan and love going to games. It's frustrating at times. Actually, it's frustrating more than it's exciting, which makes the excitement, and when they win, all the more
I thought it
all
was
the more
because you were a
fulfilling.
Prince fan, so I misunderstood.
All right, now I got to talk about the story. So so Gary talked about Prince, right? So most people know the artist formerly known as Prince, and he's passed on at this point. But there's a really cool story that came out when Carlos Boozer was playing for the Jazz. So Carlos Boozer was, I think, playing for LA and got a really awesome contract, one of the biggest contracts out there, to come and play for the Jazz. Moved here, but he kept his mansion, and I think it was Bel Air. And he kept it there because Prince wanted to rent the home from him. And he was like, yeah, I mean, and it was I can't remember what the amount of money was, but it was a lot. It was a lot of money. And so he rented the home to Prince, and then Boozer got hurt his knee, and he went to have surgery in LA. So he thought he'd just stop by his house to see how everything was going. And he, almost had a heart attack because he showed up and there was this weird symbol on the gate. He goes inside and like everything's purple and gold, and he's losing his mind. He's on the phone with his attorneys, and he's like, what? Because what Prince had done is as you just mentioned, Gary, he had taken, his identity, and through the extension of property, started to make Carlos Boozer's home his property.
Yeah.
And so he's freaking out, and then he gets a call from Prince. And Prince at the time I think he was on tour somewhere. And Prince was like, listen, like, I'm going to wire you like $500,000 right now, and I will sign a contract where everything will be the exact same way it was when the lease is up. And he held to his word, and Boozer got a big check, and
he'd removed expensive statues. He had done some really expensive stuff.
For sure. So I think he put in like some, disco club in the basement or something like this. I mean, you could look it up online. It's pretty interesting. But the reason why we bring that story up, right? A couple of things. First, there's homeowner, right? And then there's renter, right? So rent and own. But then you have essentially someone's desire to make property their own. Okay? And what they're willing to pay to make property their own, right? And obviously, from an exchange standpoint, if it's renting and owning, there has to be an equal exchange, because obviously Boozer, right, did this contract, signed this lease, assuming that Prince would just pay to live there, right? Not pay to make the house his own, right? So anyway, so the idea is like, listen, your primary residence is, whether it's renting or owning, it's a big decision, and it's not simply a practical mathematical decision, right? There's some emotional reasons, there's psychological reasons. So you have to weigh and balance all of those. So let's kind of get into, I would say, some of the primary things that you're balancing when looking at owning, when looking at renting, when to make the transition. What do you think, Gary?
Well, yeah. So, and just thinking about Prince's mindset there, right? Like, I'm not sure he's a mathematician. Like, I'm pretty sure he was not, but he probably like hired some.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he had accountants who told him that's not a really good financial idea. So why would he do it? Why would you spend so much money that you could have bought a decent house? Not that house, but he could have bought a decent house, right? He could have paid somebody else to change it the way he wanted it, and gone through that kind of a process. But the reason I think he did it is because of all of the, I would call it baggage that comes along with home ownership. Like, there's a lot. Like, you lose mobility. That's a huge one. And in today's world, and in the world where we're getting towards, I think we have a recession coming. I think we're going to see some unemployment. That's just kind of my projection or my prediction. But in times like that, or times with COVID, or things when the landscape changes on you, everybody says artificial intelligence is going to change the landscape. I have no doubt it will. But so did when we got rid of the typewriter. And so your ability to adapt also means that you can be geographically agnostic. And so when you put down roots with a house that is not a good one for multiple uses, so it's not an Airbnb house for some reason, it's not one that people want to rent from you, well, you've tied yourself potentially to a job. Potentially you've taken yourself off the market for other things. So mobility is huge when you're thinking about buying versus renting.
So a couple other things too is, I would say family, right? Because I think mobility really is, when you're trying to find what's the place you want to live in, like where's the best experience, and some people that takes back seat to, a profession, right? A job.
Yeah.
But obviously during, COVID and everyone having to work from home, by law, essentially, right? Companies figured out ways to do remote work, and whether that's going to be the future or not, right? People like started to work differently and could choose. So where they live, that was now front seat, and their profession was backseat.
Right.
Right.
Right. And so if, along with family, like part of those aspects about family is where can your kids go to school, right? So that has an impact, that has value. If you're renting a place that's in a good school district, people will pay more for it on a monthly basis to be able to put their kids in that school. And so maybe you know people, or maybe you yourself have experienced needing to be a geographic bachelor. I did that for like 5 years. Why? Because my family wanted to live up in New Jersey, and we were paying my rent and the family's house, and that wasn't a good math decision. But I'm still married to that wonderful lady 25 years later. So I'm not 25 years later, but now at 25 years. And it's a result of valuing family over just the numbers of it, right? So numbers matter, but not as much as other things.
So I would say let's maybe go through, before we transition to owning a home, let's go through the benefits of renting. So obviously you have the mobility side of things.
Yeah.
What else comes with renting that's appealing?
Well, all the emotional stuff we just talked about, like sometimes renting helps you actually get into the school district you want to get, helps you get closer to work. It allows you to decide where you really want to put down roots, right? So many people, when they get a new job or when they move to a new location, they will rent first, because if you just want to go in there and need to get your house settled so you can go to work next month or next week, then you're going to make very quick kind of gunshot type decisions, which may end up being a really bad decision, right? Yep. You may dislike your next door neighbors. You may realize that what you saw for the market was just a short-term thing, and now the market's going south on you. So you could make huge long-term financial mistakes because you didn't realize, or you didn't think about the idea of just renting for a short period.
Yep.
So renting, it's mobility, but it also can be on the financial side. How about all the extra hidden costs? Not hidden costs, but it's like the fine print on a contract when it comes to home ownership, right? Yep. There's a cost of time. I'm the new pool guy at my house. I don't know if I look like a pool guy, but I'm the pool guy because we used to have a pool guy. My wife is now the yard person because we had a homeowners association, right? And so we reduced the cost there, but the time cost went up.
So when you're renting, you don't necessarily have those, right?
Right.
If the toilet breaks, or the lawn needs, it's like, that is all essentially included in most rent. Obviously, there's exceptions, right? But you have a lot of like that maintenance and time to upkeep the property, right, that are part of rent.
Exactly, and sometimes it can go the other way because what is the cost associated with not having the wall colors that you like, and maybe you can't do that in the place you're going to go rent. Yep. So, Prince taught us that at some cost you can do it. It may not
I was
be
Boozer. I would have been like, give me $1 million. If you can wire $500,000, give me $1 million, and then I'll let you paint the walls purple.
That's right. So, so some of it's financial, but I would say on both renting, I think if I had to really sum them up, the renting side is more convenient. It's an easier solution. It's like I could cook. I could learn how to cook something. I could go find all the ingredients, or I could just pull out my credit card, right? So it's kind of like that with renting. Renting is pulling out your credit card and solving it with money. And buying is a larger commitment in both time and money, potentially ongoing expenses. It's just more involved.
So let's bring up one other thing. So we have a friend, right? Jason Hartman, and incredible guy, owns probably a lot of real estate all over the country. I believe in other countries as well. Maybe he hasn't. Actually, no, he doesn't own in other countries. It's one of his principles: own here, own local. But he rents everywhere, right? Yeah. He rents, and he does it because oftentimes you find that in the area that you rent, okay, if you bought a home, whether it's the maintenance, the mortgage payment, the margin of difference is huge. Right, whereas you're able to rent for much lower than the full cost of ownership if you had to buy. Right, so this kind of leads into the financial side of things. Yeah. Right, so Robert Kiyosaki, many of you are familiar with him. If you're not, he is written Rich Dad Poor Dad in numerous books. After that, Rich Dad Poor Dad is still the number one best-selling book on personal finance. And he makes some pretty, I would say, against the grain claims, right? And one of those claims is that your home is not an asset, right? So we believe that, saw it. He makes very good points in there. At the same time, there's some missing pieces as part of the calculation.
Yeah. So the basic buzz phrase, right, that your home is not an asset, is easily defendable, and it has really improved the financial knowledge of a large number of people who have read it. And so he wanted to dumb it down so that it was something that was easily understood. And it's just simply that you don't have cash flow coming in. So something that puts money in your pocket is an asset. Something that takes money out of your pocket is a liability, right? And so he says your house is a liability, not an asset. That's very easy to understand. Yet in our accompanying podcast and tutorial, we'll talk about that's not necessarily true when you bring in everything associated with life in America, right? So here we have inflation. We have, we also have, so our property values are appreciating. If you don't live in your house, you have to do what? You have to pay money to somebody else. And so you're putting money into the mortgage or buying or paying off your house. Then you also get tax deductions, and you can make improvements, which you get to have the value of. And so there's that whole benefit and what we were talking about the non like mechanical or monetary side of it, where you get a better quality of life, your family's happier. So there's a lot of different reasons, but on the actual mechanics or money side of it, the very basic level, yes, it does not immediately put money in your pocket, but it does grow wealth over time. And often, I would say a majority of people, wealthy people in America who have purchased and owned and operated their own properties over time have gotten wealthy because of it.
So let's just kind of draw the line in the sand. And that line, and this really comes to this claim, your home is not an asset. The line is, with exceptions, but the primary rule is that you are going to exchange money to live somewhere.
That's right.
Okay, let's just kind of draw that line. Okay, now it's typically going to rent or it's going to own. Okay, now when it comes to home ownership, you now have to exchange more. Okay,
Right.
you have typically a down payment. Okay, there's taxes, there's insurance. I mean, there are those types of costs, but you have to put money as a down payment. Now, obviously, there are some, mortgage loans that you can get that don't have very much down payment at all. Let's just assume you have to make a down payment, right? Which sometimes is not the case with rent. Sometimes it's first in months, rent, security deposit, but you still, get that back. But let's look at putting a down payment into a house, right? So that is, essentially money coming out of your pocket.
Right.
Okay. Now, Kiyosaki's definition, okay, an asset is something that puts money into your pocket. You can't argue, right, that putting money into a down payment of a home puts money in your pocket, because you would have had to have paid somebody else to live somewhere else, right, if you did not buy this home. Does that make sense?
That's right.
Okay, so now the idea is, all right, from that standpoint, okay, you have monthly payments, right? You have taxes, you have insurance, but you also get some tax benefits associated with home ownership, right? So tax benefits, you essentially can deduct the interest of a mortgage, okay, against your earned income, right? So it essentially creates some tax benefit. In addition, you have inflation, right? So inflation, we just all operate in a monetary system that we can't control, really influence, right? And it's a debt-based system. And in order for the economy to grow, money must be printed. Obviously, there's innovation and growth in that respect, but for the most part, it's obviously printing money. Stimulus is what grows an economy. So with that in mind, there's asset appreciation. Now, looking at real estate in general, especially residential real estate, okay, and there's exceptions too, but for the most part, residential real estate will appreciate pretty consistently over the course of time, right? Because of how much demand there is, and is kind of a very big part of the U.S. economy, the monetary system, and so forth. Anything you want to add to that? Does that make sense? So I'm basically saying these are some benefits, right? Your house is going to appreciate, right? You're going to get some tax benefits associated with the mortgage. So there are some benefits to take into consideration that you would not get if you were renting.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And so, like every other hard asset, we have friends, you can see easily in marketing where people will make the claim that, well, houses go up faster than, I don't know, gold goes up or other assets, right? Like, let's look at these different hard assets, and there you got raw land, you got a business or an industrial building maybe, and then you got a house. And the house has gone up historically faster or at a higher rate than other things. And I would argue that if you make the timeline long enough, 100, 200 years, right, then everything that has not gone into extinction has gone up at the same rate. Otherwise, you price yourself out of it, right? You can't have houses going up 2% higher than gold or lumber and still be using a house, right? We wouldn't be able to afford houses, or maybe the top 1% of people, and the rest of us would be living outside, right? So it just is a storehouse of value, which offsets directly however fast the monetary system is going down, right? So, however fast we're devaluing the currency, you're putting money in a house. You could put it in gold, but it sucks living inside gold, right? And it's just not as convenient. It doesn't have as many uses. But the big thing that I think we were going to get to here really shortly, so I'll just introduce it, is the beautiful ability in America to have a long-term fixed rate locked in loan that is typically below the rate of inflation because it's being subsidized by the taxes, by the taxpayers, right? I'm not saying it's a great idea. I don't like inflation personally, but it's here. And we're living in that environment. And so it provides you the ability to, our good friend Jason, again, one of the things that he says all the time is that, I could buy gold or I could buy a property. And he said a gold guy was selling me gold one time. And so I went through this little litany with him. And I said, do you know anybody who would rent my gold from me? No, they don't do that. So do you know anybody who would lend me money to buy my gold? No. And so when you're looking to buy hard assets, you can just pay $100,000 for $100,000 of gold, or you can pay $100,000 for a primary residence that you're not planning on renting out, and it's protecting you. But then when you only have to put like 20% down, now it's like you have borrowed the money to buy a bunch of gold, right? So you've locked in those hard assets, and I think that's a huge impact.
All right, so obviously there's lots of nuggets here, but as we get into math, it's hard sometimes, right?
Yeah.
When you're talking about it. So what we're doing is there's going to be a tutorial available to listeners. So just go to the link that's in the show notes, and you'll be able to access that tutorial. And in that tutorial, it's essentially going to show the actual math of renting versus owning. Okay, and if you are putting a down payment, you are putting money into buying a house. It's going to show you over the course of time, given certain assumptions, is there a return? Are you better off renting, or are you better off owning? And what you would have to earn with that money, okay, to match what you would get by owning that home. Okay, so we're going to actually show that.
Yeah, and one big key element as you're watching that is we'll specifically point out if I had to instead rent a place, and that's a game changer when it comes to that.
So a couple of other things that we're going to do with that tutorial, and we'll talk right now, because there's definitely perspective out there, right? That I understand why the perspective exists and why the philosophy exists. There's good points that are made, which is big down payment, small down payment, if you have the capacity, or 15-year mortgage versus 30-year mortgage. So obviously you can weigh both. There's pros and cons. Okay. But when it comes to opinion, when it comes to somebody's observation and they explain something in a certain way, okay, in order for it to be a good explanation, it has to be comprehensive. And part of that comprehensiveness must be the math behind it, right? So we're going to actually demonstrate in those tutorials as well. Okay. It's like, all right, here's a 15-year mortgage. Here's a 30-year mortgage. Here's the real difference, because there's some claims that are made in regards to, a 30-year mortgage where all the interest goes to the bank, whereas a 15-year mortgage, okay, not as much interest goes to the bank. And that is not entirely accurate. And so we're going to demonstrate that with math instead of trying to talk through the math in a podcast. But let's, before we move to this next episode, which is going to be real estate investment, let's talk about equity, right? Because a big down payment creates equity. Okay, a 30-year mortgage, right, creates in theory less equity than a 15-year mortgage. Okay, when it just comes to the payment and what gets applied, principal and interest. So let's talk about equity. So what is equity? Okay, why is it valuable? What are the benefits? But also, what are the limitations?
Yeah, so equity is just the value, stored value. It's like potential energy. If you remember back to physics, right? You have energy in motion, which is pushing a car forward or something, and that's cash flow. And equity is potential energy. It's cash that you could get theoretically, right? But some of the problems or the challenges of equity and things you need to hold on to and the risks that come with it, or all of the details associated with, devil's in the details, right? So how do I get that equity, right? There's a lot of different ways to get it. You can pledge it as collateral and borrow it. You can sell it. You can, how else? You kind of trade it or something like that. And so how do I get the equity? And if it's my primary residence, do I want to do that? A lot of people have different opinions on that. But I guess what I would say is that equity can be fleeting. And that's the other part. So not only is it, it is definitely illiquid, meaning you can't just snap your fingers and get it tomorrow. Even if you say, oh, no, Gary, I got this one solved. I talked to my banker and he said, I got a line of credit that I can use anytime. The banker might have woken up today and been told or decided on his own that this is not a good idea anymore and taken that away, right? So you don't actually own the equity if somebody else just gave you a little ticket that you can turn in to get the equity out of your property. So that's something that's why I push back often. It's not always the right answer to pay off your mortgage, right? That could be putting you in potential risk because of the illiquid side of it. The other thing is that equity is fleeting. So maybe the other reason that the banker doesn't lend you the money when you decide to go get it is because you missed a market report that your property is not worth what it was before because somebody's decision. The factory moved out of town and now there's unemployment and all of a sudden no one wants to live here and your property's not worth that anymore. Or they found out that it was on an old gas station property and there's oil and gas everywhere underground. So it could be any number of things that results in your equity not being what you thought it was. And if you didn't pull the cash out before you found that out, it's not there. So it can be fleeting and it can be illiquid.
So equity, again, I think the technical, right, would be the difference between asset value or what you can sell it for and whatever loan or obligations are against it that you owe, right? So that's that's the difference. But then that difference, the only way for that difference to materialize, right, is through getting a loan against it, which, right, has all sorts of contingencies associated with it. What you could sell it for, which has contingencies as well, because the true value of a home isn't what Zillow says. The true value of a home is what someone will pay for it.
Right.
Okay, and that can change from one day to the next, 1 month to the next. Okay, and then there's other claims against your property from the tax commission as well as the mortgage holder, where if you default on those, they essentially have access to your equity to make them whole. Right.
That's right.
So there's lots of limitations there. As at the same time, you could put it on your balance sheet, right? It's basically the delta between your assets and liability, your asset and your liability. So looking at equity, again, equity is valuable in a sense. It has economic value. But as we get into the perpetual wealth strategy and ways in which you can apply the principles and the strategies of the perpetual wealth strategy, that is where we're able to show, okay, you can have equity in multiple locations, especially when it comes to home ownership, right? And so looking at equity inside of a piece of property, if you had options where you had just as much equity, if not more, but you didn't have the contingencies that equity has inside of a property, okay, now it comes down to, okay, maybe I should adjust my strategy, adjust my thinking. The end result, obviously, is to maximize your wealth, but do it in a way that has the highest degree of certainty possible.
We were just talking about, we use something that Patrick has already introduced in the podcast, and I'd recommend you go back and look through it. And it's the Perpetual Wealth Strategy. And one of the elements of that, kind of the framework through which I discuss wealth with all of my clients, is called a hierarchy of wealth, right? And it's just a framework, and it's an idea of if you were to build an Egyptian pyramid, I want to start at the bottom and get the bottom foundational layers right, and then build up from there. And it's a relationship where things on the bottom are where you have capital, or you have resources, and you are in the highest amount of control. That stuff is certain, it's guaranteed to be there, and it's liquid so you can go get it. And then when you move up from there, you give up some control, and therefore you take on risk. And maybe what you're giving up in control is the ability to get it immediately. And so just barely above the guaranteed liquid certain portion is our primary residence. And so it's in, technically in tier 2, but it's right at the bottom because you have a ton of control over that thing. Not everything. You don't control whether the factory moves out of town, like we talked about in the previous segment, and you lose some of the equity because its valuation goes down. But you do control about whether the maintenance gets done and how you treat the place, right? And whether you make the payments or not and still hold on to the asset. So all of that stuff you do control. So the perpetual wealth strategy with this foundation underneath it so that you can hold equity in a place where it's liquid, cash reserves, it provides some protection, is really important when you're getting into something that's illiquid and a long-term commitment like buying a primary residence. You don't want to take all of your available cash and put it into your property because you could lose your house and everything you just worked for to build up for that just because you had a roof failure or a HVAC issue that got you behind on your credit cards, and then you couldn't make the payments, and now everything's gone. And you just look back on it and you're like, what happened? 6 months ago, I had enough money for a down payment on a house, and today I'm homeless with no money, right? And so recognizing the illiquidity of the equity, of just the unique aspects of this asset, of this not so simple decision about buying the place where you're going to lay your head down, is really important to understand. How do I set myself up for success? And it all comes back to looking at life through the lens of hierarchy of wealth and making sure there's something below it that keeps this thing standing upright.
So I'll add a couple of things to that. I think the Perpetual Wealth Strategy, and if you haven't watched the series or listened to the series, right, there's three fundamental tenets, right? It's cash flow protection, and then wealth. And depending on where you're at in life, it could be wealth accumulation. That might be the objective. You might be later in life, and it's wealth distribution. Okay, you may be focused on distributing wealth through your estate planning, which we call legacy. So right now we'll just talk cash flow protection and wealth. And we believe that these tenets are followed in sequence. So before investing, cash flow is the most important. It's money coming in and money going out. Over the course of time, as I've been doing this, since 2007, I actually had my first exposure to personal finance when I was in college, and I was working in a call center that essentially was a nonprofit that helped people avoid bankruptcy by negotiating credit card balances, right, into, one little payment, reducing the interest rate, sometimes reducing the balance. But it was fascinating to me because it's when I saw just how much debt people have, like what people get burdened with. And it's not because they did it intentionally, it's because they did not have a cash flow strategy. They didn't have a strategy to really look at, okay, money coming in, money going out. How do I determine this is the money coming in? This is what I should spend on a car payment. This is what I should spend on a house. This is how much I should save. Okay. Over the course of time, and even getting into being a financial advisor, most people, even those that have a lot of means, right? Without a cash flow strategy, they find themselves in a very difficult position. So understanding where your cash flow is going to be paramount to knowing how much house you can afford. Now, what you said, Gary, which is, I don't know, sometimes I think we look at life and we just assume we're bulletproof and nothing bad is ever going to happen, right? Then your brakes go out, your washer and dryer go out, your refrigerator goes out, your kid needs braces, your kid needs to go to emergency room, right? You have to put a deductible, on your health. It's like there are cash needs that are above and beyond cash flow, right? That most people do not have in liquidity, right? So what we consider as part of cash flow is like, 2-3 months of your expenses and liquidity to buffer, right? Those, I would say, expenses that come out of nowhere. Then protection is also important, right? We talk about wealth accumulation, right, is often the focal point of investment, but wealth accumulation, right, it's contingent on everything working out, right, with the investment, but also working out in life. It doesn't take into consideration if you get disabled, if you're sued, if you get divorced, right? There's so many other things that can happen in life that can completely disrupt that compounding curve of wealth accumulation that people aren't adequately protected for. And by the time they realize that there is, some risk and vulnerability, liability, it's too late and they have to start over, right? Or that compound wealth curve of wealth accumulation takes a big dip and you got to start that curve all over again.
Yeah. And so, cash flow is obviously what keeps us, it's like blood for our bodies, right? Like if the heart's not pumping, if there's no blood flow, we're in trouble, right? And so cash flow is what keeps our lives rolling. Yet I think what many people will say that cash is trash, right? And what they mean by that, I believe, is that it's not earning anything. It's being devalued in the bank with inflation, and it's not earning anything for me. And then that's the end of the conversation, and they don't have emergency fund. They don't have any cash in the bank. Why don't you have cash? Cash is trash. It drove me nuts that it wasn't earning, and so I got it. I put it somewhere in a property that's illiquid, and so now they're down this path of really taking on a lot of risk. So you can generate cash flow by snapping your fingers if you have money sitting somewhere where it's liquid in your control, right? I had a client that I was speaking with recently who had a negative $2,000 a month cash flow. He was bleeding $2,000 a month, and it was stressing him out. So he had money sitting in the bank, and he used that money to pay off the loan. And so then the cash flow problem went away. But the problem now is that if some separate, unrelated thing comes up, now he doesn't have any options, right? Whereas he could have just taken $2,000 a month out of that money he had sitting in the bank and made it zero cash flow, right? So you can solve challenges if you have an emergency fund. So in that scenario we were talking about in the previous segment where the air conditioning system goes out, which results in the loss of your house, boy, wouldn't it have been nice to be able to solve that challenge with cash? Like that truly is an emergency because, being homeless is an emergency. And so just having the cash sitting around, really, really important. So you have to remember the liquidity side when you're getting ready to buy a house like this.
Yep. So I think what we're trying to say as we kind of transition into the next episode is, we look at personal finance, right, in the context of the perpetual wealth strategy, right? And the idea in the end, I'll keep saying it, right? It's to maximize, it's to optimize the amount of wealth, but increase the amount of certainty. And I would say achieve your financial goals, your financial targets, what you want to live in, how you want to live in life, the lifestyle of your dreams. Okay, but do it with the highest degree of certainty possible. So that's why we're going through this, because real estate investment, even primary residence ownership, right? It fits within this framework. It fits within this context. Okay, and sometimes people buy too much house. Sometimes people buy too little house. Okay, and that has an effect on life experience, family experience, just as much as buying too much house and being stressed because of payments and stressed because of maintenance, and right? So looking at really making the best decision, there's a calculated way to do it. That's what we specialize in. It's one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast and why we continue to educate you, our valuable clients. Even though this is a podcast, for anyone that wants to listen, but those who have done business with us, have started to follow our strategies. The idea is to continue the education so that, as you're making future decisions, you're just reminded of, hey, there are ways to optimize your wealth. There are ways to maximize your wealth, but do it by taking less risk instead of taking more risk.
And the final thing I wanted to say on this was that you can't make this decision or any other important decision in a vacuum. I mean, it's okay to, make a rash decision of what soda you want in the checkout line. Like that's a short-term problem if you get it wrong, right? But making the wrong decision about what house to get, where to get one, or to buy instead of rent is not something you want to take in a vacuum. And I'm not saying like you want to involve your advisors. You definitely do want to do that. But what I'm talking about is you have to take your entire financial picture together as a whole to decide how does this affect everything else. And so just as a quick example, like we're thinking about what do we do in retirement? If I buy this house, am I putting my retirement at risk? Maybe, but maybe you're solving the challenge because there's a thing like a reverse mortgage that is, gets a black eye from a lot of people. And the primary reason is because they always wanted to leave this house to the kids, right? They have this, this was perfect for me 40 years ago. So why wouldn't it be perfect for my kids, right? And what do you have? You have this phrase about, PITA assets.
Oh yeah,
right?
the PITA assets.
Those that are a pain and you can finish it.
Pain in the ass assets, I'll say it.
So the kids generally don't want that old house that they grew up in, like, and it's just not the right trendy thing for today. And so you can, if you have another way to restore the equity to the family, to keep the legacy around and still get the value out of this house, it can be a paycheck for you in your retirement. And so, a good friend of ours goes through this, and maybe we'll make this one of our tutorials as well if we have an opportunity, is how can I take the equity out of my primary residence and use it as a cash flow for the rest of my life? I don't end up having to live with my kids in their third bedroom. And when we pass away, then they can make the decision. Do I want to use, for example, the money that I got from the life insurance death benefit, tax-free? Do I want to use that to pay off the house and keep it within the family? Some people make that decision. Or do I want to just let the bank have the house, take the payout amount, and keep the death benefit, right? And so that's a decision you don't have if you don't holistically put all these things together.
And prepare for it.
Right.
Yep. All right. Well, hey, thank you guys. This has been obviously, a discussion around something that most people will face at some point or other, and likely multiple times. I want to reemphasize something Gary said, and then we'll move on. Right? There isn't a perfect decision, right? Making decisions in a vacuum all makes sense, but reality doesn't happen in a vacuum. That life tomorrow is going to be different than life today, and you just don't know what's down the road. So the idea is just making the best decisions possible. So stick with us to the next segment, because as we kind of stack the principles of real estate and then put that into practice with regards to a primary residence, now we're going to associate those same principles to owning property that you lease and exchange with others besides yourself. So stick with us to episode 3.